Hi, I'm Spencer Krause. I've been building robots for over 20 years. In that time, I've seen a lot of interesting things, and I've heard a lot of interesting stories. Collaborative with Spencer Krause is a place where my peers and I can relax, have a drink, and talk about some of the crazier things we've seen at work and some of the experiences we've had that have gotten us to where we are today. Subscribe today to join the collaboration. Welcome to the Collaborative Podcast. I'm your host, Spencer Krause. Our guest today is Phil Koopman. Phil is one of the world's experts on robot safety and an in the process of retiring Carnegie Mellon professor. Hope you get there soon, buddy. Welcome to the pod.
Thanks, Spencer. Good to be here. I'm working as hard as I can. I'm retiring. I'm using the Cheshire Cat model, and you can still see my head, but soon all you'll be able to see is my smile. That's where we're doing it.
I don't know, Matt. I think that, to use my dad's cousin Lee Weiss as an example, I mean, I don't know if some people that are as serious as you ever really retire. And I say that kind of as a taunt. So I realize that. But, I don't know. Good luck. Chuck Whitaker just did it. Maybe you'll actually do it too.
Well, it depends what you mean retire. I'm retiring from the university, which means I'm not teaching anymore. So this semester is professional leave. So I taught my last class last semester, ended in December.
Nice.
And I'm not getting paid this semester, but the paperwork clears on July 1st to be officially retired. It's just how things work. But last week I was in Sweden at a PhD defense, so I'm still kind of sort of doing the professor thing. I don't know. It's a ramp down, right? Instead of just chopping everything off and slamming the door behind me, that's not how you do it. You ramp down. It takes a couple months to get all the loose ends cleared up. And then I'm shifting over to consulting, and I'm working on another project we can talk about later, and things like that. So it's not doing the hardcore professor gig anymore, but doing the things I want to do and the things I enjoy doing, and the things that help people. But just I'm not doing the publish or perish thing anymore. I'm not teaching formal university classes, but I'm doing a bunch of other related stuff. So it's not. Old professors don't retire. They just sort of go emeritus, which means I still have an ID card, but they don't pay me and I don't have to show up.
Nice. Oh, well, that seems awesome. I mean, I know they cut off my CMU email when I got out of grad school, but you did a lot more for them than I did. So it makes sense. That's awesome. So what's next for you? What are some of the things you're looking into doing, once you kind of finish getting the retirement ball all the way down the retirement court?
Well, right now I'm doing some bucket list stuff. Okay. So this is something we don't talk about as much. People are really, kind of pushing the career, but at some time it will come time to slow down. And so I'll tell you a couple things I'm doing just to give people ideas what that looks like. People like, what would it even look like for a professor to retire? Well, like I said, I was in Sweden last week for a PhD defense. So it's a gradual blending as opposed to a cold turkey thing. And the other thing, though, is the couple weeks before that, I was in Utah with my wife doing 5 national parks and a national monument and putting 1,300 miles on a rent-a-car and hiking 2 hours, 3 hours every day. And that was a blast. That's been on our bucket list for years. And I said, you know what? Part of the retirement deal is I'm going to make time for stuff I want to do. And if there's work I could do, I'm just going to delay it. There's always time. So that's part of it too, to catch up on things while I've still got my health. I can still walk a couple hours a day, go to scuba dive in a couple months and, make sure I get in all the stuff that I've been putting off for my profession. If you keep putting off, you never get to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's part of it too.
When you first mentioned the bucket list, I was going to circle back and say in our last episode, we talked about you swimming with sharks. And I was like, what could be more bucket list than that? But it sounds like there's a backlog.
The national parks. Yeah, in fairness, it was more my wife's bucket list, but I hadn't done them either. So I'm glad we did. We said some really cool stuff. Just drive all around Utah and see all the big parks. It's everyone's different. It's totally worth it, but you better have a full week because that's what it takes. There's a lot of driving involved.
I mean, it sounds like you could take a month if you wanted. I'm so jealous of that, right? I mean, you don't get to do that very often.
That's right. But this is the time, right? And so there's some other stuff that we're going to look at doing, just doing that, spending some more time with my granddaughter, those kind of things. Okay. So there's that.
Sounds
But it
lovely.
doesn't mean I'm sitting on the beach for the rest of my life.
I mean, sit on a beach as well. Like,
and
there's nothing wrong with that.
well, I'll be on the beach in June, but
That's
that's not the entire 24/7 plan. The rest of it is, as you get more senior, sometimes you decide to go back to basics. That all as a researcher, we're going deep and narrow, and I've told this, and I didn't make it up, that the a perfect PhD student is an impulse function. He's got 0 width, infinite height, and unit area, and that's the
oh,
research world.
that's funny. Yeah, it took a second.
And the area has to be just enough to squeeze out a PhD thesis on the narrowest thing you could imagine to keep it manageable, and that's okay. That's part of the process. As a after you get tenure, you can do crazier stuff and not be as worried. So I've been into a bunch of things for research, done a lot of self-driving car work lately, but that's not the only thing I've done in my career, just the most recent. And that's great, but I'm not gonna just stop doing that, but I've ramped down. If you look on social media, my post intensity has ramped down, and that's on purpose because I wanna spend my time doing other things as well.
Now that you mention it, I haven't seen as much traffic from you lately. That makes sense.
That is intentional. That's not
Yeah, nice.
I'm not dead. I just I'm not gonna post on every little thing because there's other people who can do it, and I'm just gonna post on the things I'm passionate about or just hit me a certain way or whatever. So that's the plan there.
Now's
So
your moment
expect
to
to see
shine, Sean Dotson.
so expect to see less of me on social media. I'm on Substack now,
Cool.
and that's going really well. So I'm gonna try and post like once a month on Substack and read this random stuff, but then a real primary essay once a week. So you're gonna still see me, just not with such intensity because I have other things I'm doing with my life.
Yeah, well, I mean, that almost sounds like, kind of a more relaxed approach to it where you're going to be able to write more meaningful things with those essays that you're targeting on Substack.
Right? Yeah. So I can spend time on the stuff that I want to write about as opposed to the stuff I have to write about.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And now to a degree, I'd already been sort of doing that, but I'm more committed to doing that. And if something happens in the news and I don't have something unique to contribute about it, I may just let it go. And it doesn't mean I didn't see it or I don't care about it. Just if everyone else already said the stuff that needs to be said, I'm not going to spend my time saying it yet again.
Yeah,
Right?
it makes sense.
Yeah. So that's part of it. But the other thing is going back to basics. You'll see a lot of senior professors just go back to basics. They'll say, "I'm going to teach the freshman course because now that I really have that depth of experience, I can communicate it better what the essence is." And I'm not going to go back. I'm not going to be teaching transistor theory or anything like that. But what I may be doing is spending more time thinking just about what safety means. And I've sort of started that already. My last couple papers, scholarly papers going out the door were about, we ought to really rethink what safety means in the age of AI. But beyond that, just beyond AI, just people really struggle with safety. There's so much dysfunction in safety. So I'm considering. I haven't fully committed yet. So this is a speculative conversation, but I'm considering spending more time just on making it easier for people to understand and get to safety.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, that seems valuable because I feel like safety in general as a non-safety expert, but as a robotics expert is pretty mystical. I mean, like it almost seems a little bit inaccessible because you've got a whole set of tools that are different and, regulations and obviously the reason for it is obvious, which is, just to not hurt people. But then, like how much do you need to do that? And, because like at some point statistically, if you walk out of your house, a million times, like one of those times you might get hit by a bolt of lightning. Like, I mean, like, you
The
know,
proverbial safe falling out of the second story window. Yeah.
right. Yeah. Piano, like, Wile E.
Right.
Coyote, whatever. I mean, how do you parse that into a form that, like somebody like me could understand, for instance?
Well, that's probably half of it. Half of it is people are not good at reasoning about low probability, high severity events. And that's hard. And partly it's because it's hard, but also partly because things that are literally beyond human experience, airplane falls out of the sky once per billion hours. We're not going to be around a billion hours. What does a billion hours even feel like? It's literally beyond human experience, right? So it's hard to reason about those kind of things. That's part of it. The other part of it is people have misconceptions about how you actually get safety. Uh, and so let's, if you don't mind, I want to talk about that. That's
Yeah,
sort of my
absolutely.
message for today. All right. Let me start with what safety is really about, and then we can get into misconceptions. There's a thing called safety engineering. Now, you probably have heard those words, but the question is, what do they mean? People think safety engineering. Well, what is just safety? Well, if my code doesn't have bugs, it must be safe, right? And that's not it at all. It has almost nothing to do with that. It has a little tiny bit to do with it, but that's not the thing. Or I use the misRC subset, so I must be safe. I've actually heard people say that thinking it was true. Like, well, no, that's you don't get safety by having a particular language use. Safety is something much different. So down in the basics of when you're designing a system, you typically start with requirements. Now, I know you don't have a complete set and you iterate. I get all that, right? But at some point, there has to be a requirement of some sort. You can call it a user story, go call it whatever you want, but you have to know what you're building or you're not going to build it. And if you're prototyping, what are you doing? You're discovering requirements so the next time you can know what you're building, right? So ultimately, there have to be requirements. And I'm not being legalistic about this. This isn't about, well, is that controlled vocabulary stuff? It just, you have to have requirements. You got to have it.
That
Otherwise,
makes
you don't know
sense.
what you're doing. Okay. All right, fine. But there are two types of requirements. This is really simplifying. One type of requirement is a functionality requirement, the thing you're going to build. Well, the robot's going to pick up the hammer and hit a nail with it. Okay, great. And people, engineers in particular, spend almost all their time thinking about the requirements to get the job done. But think about it. If you're going to have a robot arm to pick up a hammer, just pull that out of thin air. Uh, there's a small number of ways to get that right. How many ways are there to get that wrong? Like all of them, right?
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I would think you.
I could just watch your brain explode, right?
Yeah,
Well, you could not pick up the hammer. You could pick up the hammer, and when you swing it, goes flying out and going across the room and whacking into something.
sure.
And you could hit the nail and bend the nail. You could smash the effector holding the nail in place. There's all sorts of ways for this
Hammer
to
could
go.
break. Yeah, there's a
Hammer-
lot of different
There's
things.
a lot of ways this goes wrong, and there's only a very few ways it goes right. Okay. In your requirements, did it talk about the ways it goes wrong?
You're talking about
You ju
particular. Oh,
Yeah,
okay,
if
yeah.
you just imaginary
Hypothetical.
requirements. No, you were thinking about putting the nail in
I mean, it would be
the
so long, right? Like, I mean, I've
right.
I've worked on like 1,400 requirement sets
Yeah,
before, but like I feel like if you do you can't enumerate infinity. I mean, like, how do you do that?
it's called safety engineering. Okay. You got to the point. So the most engineering people spend all the time in school learning regular engineering, which on a good day when the professor teach requirements, which is a whole different issue, right? Hey, but you have a homework assignment, you have a project assignment, you have something that's your requirements. And you talk about, okay, here's what it has to do. And you get it working, and that's cool. But the difference between a cool demo and a product is you have to ask what happens when something goes wrong. And safety is about something going wrong with unacceptably high consequences. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, what you do in safety engineering at its heart is you say, I'm going to make up a list of hazards. These are things that could go wrong. And depending on which standard you follow and which technical community you hang out in, there's slightly different definitions of hazards. So it's a lot of safety terminologies all over the place. But for our let's try and keep it simple and intuitive. One of the hazards is the hammer could slip out of the hand and go flying around, right? Another hazard you mentioned is the hammer could break. Okay. Another hazard is you could miss the nail. You could miss the nail, and there are various ways of missing the nail that are a problem. You could bend the nail, you could hit the effector holding the nail, you could damage the workpiece. There's a bunch of things. And you're right, there's an infinite number of hazards, but not every hazard really matters. So there's some art in picking the things that are going to be a problem and picking the things that are either so unlikely you're not going to worry about it or inflict so little damage that just, you know,
You're still not going to worry
well,
about it.
we're still not going to worry about it. And we're not, or we're not going to worry about it till it happens. And if it's happening all the time, it'll be obnoxious and we'll fix it then. Right.
Yeah, it makes
Okay.
sense.
So safety engineering is listing a set of hazards about the things that can go wrong and deciding what you're going to do. And some hazards are so low consequence, you just say, well, just live with it. And some hazards are, well, dinging the workpiece is painful, so we're going to do best effort, but we're not going to go crazy about it. And some hazards are life critical, and that means you need two computers checking each other, and you're worried about single event upsets, and the software has to, no kidding, be perfect because the slightest software defect and someone dies. Well, that's different than bending a nail, right?
Sure. Yeah, much higher consequence.
Right. So there's safety as hazards. It has safety requirements that are to mitigate the hazards, but how much you mitigate the hazard has to do with how much risk is presented. So that's it. That's safety engineering in a nutshell. That's it. And all the standards and all the other stuff are just there to support that idea.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That is an amazing distillation of safety engineering.
Well, you have to be my age old to be able to say it that simply, I guess. I don't. Well, we're back to this. The senior professors have chewed on it so long that sometimes they're able to distill it. So I'm gonna for sure I'm gonna spend a little time doing that with safety. I just don't know whether that's a long-term thing or a 3 months project, and then I sort of get bored and move on to the next. We're gonna see how that turns out.
We definitely have to isolate that clip. I mean, like that's Carl. If you're listening, when you're listening, you got to isolate that clip. That is
Yep.
gold right
It's like
there.
because people say, well, safety engineering. Well, it means you have to have the code perfect. Well, no, you don't have to have the code perfect. Why would you want the code perfect? You'd want the code perfect because that particular code, if it misbehaves, can result in a death. But another piece of code is no big deal, so it doesn't have to be perfect.
So it's all
Right.
like prioritization and
Based
triage
on,
and
based on risk. It's based on risk.
based on risk. Okay.
Now, there are some principles that matter here. Once you get past that, how you get there with computers, you need redundancy because computers aren't perfect. They have computation errors. That's a thing, right?
Yeah, there's hardware errors too. I mean, even
There's a reason you have parity on memory,
yeah,
And there's a reason you have CRCs and checksums on network messages, right? Because these machines aren't perfect.
for sure.
And so you do stuff like, well, if it's high severity and the machine can be imperfect, we better have a plan B to catch it if it's wrong, or two computers that cross check, or some safety envelope that says, well, we don't have to recompute everything, but we know if the hammer, if the hammer's going to not hit the nail at all, we want to freeze the system, right? Even if we're not sure if it's the perfect hitting spot. To go back to that example, there's a bunch of ways you can do it, and so safety gets very, very complex. There's a lot to it.
Did you know that Collaborative with Spencer Krause now has a merch store? Please go to cwskmerch.com for the latest in CWSK styles. You can get a hoodie, like the one I'm wearing, t-shirts, hell, we even have whiskey glasses. Everything in the store has custom art that our team worked really, really hard on, so go ahead and show your support for them, me, and the rest of the CWSK team by going to cwskmerch.com today. Better yet, support yourself and use discount code PODCAST10, all one word, all uppercase, for 10% off your entire order. Thanks for your support and enjoy the rest of the show. With Spencer Krause is sponsored by SKA Robotics. If you're in the market for elite field robotics expertise, please consider hiring SKA Robotics. They sponsor this podcast and solve some of the toughest engineering problems in the world. SKA Robotics can be found at skarobotics.com. Do you ever discover in a safety engineering engagement that maybe it just isn't economical to build a system like at this point in history?
Well, sometimes the right answer is don't build it. There's in the UK, there everything I talked about. There's like 100 places you could go. So we're not going to go to all of them for
Fair
sure.
enough.
But in the UK, they have a thing called ALARP, as low as reasonably practical, and it says you should reduce the risk based on the best you can do, not just, oh, I don't want to bother, but like, no, there's known techniques and there's known tools and there's known everything, and you applied all of them, and that's the best you can do, so it must be good enough. And the answer is the best you can do might not be good enough to be societally acceptable. There's some systems you shouldn't build because ALARP is not actually socially acceptable. And there's still an open question to this day whether robotaxis, even if you made one ALARP, it may not be safe enough for people to want it, right?
Yeah.
We're still finding out. We don't know. The jury's still out. We're going to find out.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. There's incidents all the time, which is,
Yep. And then
to death about.
we're gonna see. That's a whole different podcast.
Yeah.
I think we're gonna be part of that one. But that's
I would
that's
record
the
that
right
podcast.
question. There's some things you just shouldn't be building because the technology isn't there yet. And sometimes you don't know until you've built it how that turns out.
Well, I'm even thinking about like from a business case perspective, like maybe you could make it safe, but if it's, I don't know, I'm making something up, but if you had a consumer product where, there's a safety critical component to it and, the consequences of it, messing up or severely injuring somebody and you need like 3 sets of computers. I feel like the Segway is a good example of this, right? So like, I mean, they did that, right? They had like a voting system and multiple computers, but the thing cost $5,000 and nobody bought it. So it was like, does it make sense to make it safely within the reasonable nature of what people are willing to pay for? And so,
Well, that's true. There's another side of that same coin, which is if you made a car that guaranteed no one ever died, but it cost $1 million a car, you wouldn't be able to sell them, right?
there's no
Not many.
total
They're
drivable
very
market for
the
them.
market for $1 million
It is,
cars
but it's
is very
small.
small.
Yeah, exactly.
Very small, and it's not about safety, it's about high performance, right?
Right. And so how many people that are willing to spend $1 million in a car would do it for absolute? There's probably a few. Like I bet like if you're transporting around heads of state, and I mean this is a tangent, but like there's probably a market for that, but it's not a very large one to your point.
Yeah, it's not a viable market, right?
Yeah.
So then you get into another piece of this whole thing is cost of human life, value of human life, right? And how much do you spend to save harm? And part of safety is being able to grapple with that. That engineers are very uncomfortable saying, "Well, this product is going to kill so many people per million miles." It's like, but you can't be perfect. You're not going to be perfect, and if you refuse to admit a number, then you're just fooling yourself because the number is not zero.
Right.
It's a very low number. It has to be a very low number for most things, but it's not zero. And getting comfortable with that is also, a difficult thing, but you have to have that conversation. Now there are legal reasons why you might or might not want to write down the number, but not writing it down doesn't make the fact go away that it's not zero, right? There are going to be crashes. You're driving a car. I don't care if everything in the world's a robotaxi. There's still going to be crashes.
Yeah. I mean, and there already are with everything in the world not being a robot. Like either way, it's unavoidable that, when you,
And that doesn't make it unsafe. So when we talk
oh,
about safety, people want it to be completely safe, and there is no such thing. Okay, but there's acceptably safe.
so who decides what that is?
Aha. Well, okay. So that was one of the academic things I did recently. Okay, and the way it works now is the companies who build the thing want to decide what's safe enough. And it boils down to, sadly, it often boils down to if it's cheaper to settle the lawsuits, or if we can settle the lawsuits and buy insurance and make money, we're good to go. Even if a normal person would say that's insanely dangerous product.
Yeah.
So that's tricky.
I'm not
So
saying that's morally correct, but it makes sense how we would end up there.
that's how our economy works, right? So what you want is other stakeholders at the table to say, well, I know you can make money doing that, but it's still not okay. And in particular, what you find is the court system systematically undervalues human life in many jurisdictions.
Can you give me
Uh,
some
it-
examples of jurisdictions and settlements on a human wrongful death? I mean, just out of
okay,
curiosity. Like this is 2025 for people listening. We're
right.
recording this in March just to give people like a
Oh,
benchmark on the economy.
yeah.
If you want
So
to go,
I
you
have
don't have to.
I have an old number. I have an old number for a court that in the Toyota unintended acceleration, it was a couple $1 million. It was not a lot.
That's all.
And right now, it was not a lot, okay? So it was a very small amount, and if you wanna see if you go see my Toyota talk, I have the actual numbers. It's been so long, I don't have them
Fair
behind
enough.
it. But it can easily be a couple $1 million depending jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions much higher than others, right? But and the truck industry complains about nuclear verdicts. They call them nuclear verdicts. "Oh, we had this truck crash. There was a nuclear verdict that the jury just, did something crazy, completely unreasonable. It was a $10 million verdict." Okay. So right now there's a lot of feeling $10 million is completely excessive for a truck hitting a car, which can cause a lot of damage, right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like, life changing for the surviving relatives. I mean, if, you lose
Right.
a parent or a loved one or a child, I mean,
Or a lifelong injury.
or a lifelong injury. Good point. Yeah. Especially if it's an injury to like part of your body that's related to your
Yeah, a
career.
wheelchair or something,
Yeah.
it's not only is it horrific for the individual, but there's a lot of expense that adds up over a lifetime.
Yeah.
Okay. So right now the feeling is 10 million is nuclear. That is literally the word they use. All right. But if you go to the U.S. Department of Transportation, they have a thing called the statistical value of life. And they track the statistical value of human life. And they use a bunch of different sources. This is an empirical thing where they look at all these, it's an economic unit, that this is how much it's a typical person is worth over the rest of their life, right?
And this is just a
And
mean.
it's a mean. It's a mean.
Okay.
Okay. It's a mean of if a person dies, this is how much the life was worth in economic terms. And the reason they do that is if you're putting guardrails onto a highway, you want some notion of, well, it's $1 million. It's a $10 million project to put these guardrails on. Is it worth $10 million to do it? Are we going to save enough lives to be worth $10 million? Because you can't spend $1 billion to spend one life.
Right.
But saying it's $100, nah, we're not going to bother. Well, that's also wrong, right? So there
Correct.
has to be a number. There is a number. The number is currently 13 million.
Oh, interesting. That's a lot more than the nuclear verdict.
Exactly.
30% more, but still, yeah, it's more.
And you got it on one.
Yeah.
Yes, $10 million is actually a slight discount.
And that's
for
the
current
government
number.
number. I feel like,
That's-
that's
yeah.
not my.
That's
not
an
what I'm
economic
accustomed to.
number, not a
That's
sentiment.
interesting.
It's not a sentimental number. It's an economic number.
What is it
right?
based off of? Like, how do they calculate that at a very high level?
It's like jobs and salaries and living expenses and if you're the breadwinner in your house and there's people depending on you, you're going to earn money and
That
that's
makes
the number.
sense.
And if you have a 40 or 50 year working life, money heads up over 50
Yeah,
years, right?
but a lot of times the companies are willing to settle and people are willing to settle much lower than that, which is how you get the real not the real number, but the number that comes out in court of like closer to
The market rate is a lot lower. So when Krause dragged that poor woman down the street, they settled for, they said 8 to 12 is the number I saw in press.
which is still below that number.
No, well, she didn't die, but
Fair enough.
it was horrific. But people like, that's a huge number. It's like, well, no, that's about right.
Yeah.
So people don't have a sense for that. And when you understand that number, then things like putting in two computers starts making a lot more sense if someone could die.
That makes sense. But I mean, I guess to my earlier point, like at some point, like for certain products, you're going to exceed the, reasonable bill of material and you just shouldn't make that product
Oh,
commercially.
Well, you shouldn't make it. So we're back to the other side of the coin. One side of the coin is you shouldn't make stuff that is excessively dangerous, right?
Or
You
it
shouldn't.
just doesn't make economic sense. And in this
Or
case,
mitigating the risk would cost too much, right?
Right,
We're back
yeah.
to hazard mitigation. Sometimes the hazard is too much.
too great.
Well, what do you do? If you're in safety and you say there's a hazard and I can't mitigate it economically, what can you do? One thing you can do is you can say, all right, I'm going to change the product definition so we don't do that. I can't drive on rainy days. Guess what? We're not going to drive on rainy days, right?
Sure. And when you meet a user that doesn't violate that user manual,
And you put warning stickers on saying you're not allowed to do it.
Fair
okay.
enough.
And you put in things to discourage it. You don't weaken a nod, say, oh, it's okay. That's just for the lawyers, right? You don't do stuff like that, right? You
Yeah.
just say, no, you can't do this. It's too
So if you
dangerous.
just had the car shut off, if it detected rain, for instance. I mean,
Yeah. So basically, if it's a self-driving car, you want it to disable itself if it's being used in an area that the designers know it's not safe.
now there's a craze where kids are finding hoses and just spraying a little bit of super soaker on the hoods of all the self-driving cars to ground the fleet.
Well, and you have to worry about foreseeable use and all that. So that's one. But another thing you can do is you can argue that the value of the product is so high that it's socially desirable to have this product in use, even though it presents this risk you can't mitigate. All right. And what do you do then? So that's partly warning stickers saying, well, you have to have a driver license. Cars are super dangerous.
Right. No, that makes sense. But like the
You can't make it so they don't crash. So we make everyone have a license so that they're more skilled. And that's our risk mitigation rather than having the car be crash proof.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Industrial scale fireworks. You don't just
People
go
love
down.
them.
Yeah, really. You really want to be a trained professional for this stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a bunch of things, or fly aviation. You have to have a pilot's license, right?
Yeah, and those are not easy to get from experience. It's a lot of work.
Yeah. Yep. So you have a hazard, you have to mitigate the risk from it. One way is to avoid the hazard, say, we're just not going to go there. Okay. in a lot of automated train systems, there's the people barriers to keep the people off the tracks. Because if you can't get on the tracks, you don't have to worry about hitting people on the tracks because you know they're not there, right? So some of it is to control the operational environment. Some of it is technical mitigation. Some of it is training people or procedural mitigation. Here's the checklist. Don't do this thing because it's too dangerous. And some of it is you just take out insurance and you insure against the risk and you just say, we're going to accept the risk and we're going to insure against it. And the dysfunction there is if the harm done by the hazard exceeds the market price for compensating someone for it, then you have a market dysfunction.
And that gets down to the economic harm, the way you're describing harm.
Yeah,
You
we
can't
just
quantify
revisited
moral
that.
harm. Yep.
Yeah, we revisited the economic. Now there's another way we deal with that. So when you have a system where it's too cheap to invoke harm, the economists like to call it negative externalities that are underpriced, right? You're going to do harm to someone that isn't you, and it's going to be free to you, but it costs them.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, I'm following now.
Okay, like pollution. We're going to emit pollution, and it doesn't bother us. Why should we care?
Yep.
Or we're gonna harm bystanders with something, but for whatever
Noise
reason,
pollution. Yeah.
noise pollution. Yeah, they can't hold us accountable, or
Secondhand smoke up until recently. Yeah, like take your
pick your favorite thing, right?
Yeah.
So basically, if there's no cost associated with doing harm to others, then there's no economic incentive to avoid it. There's a similar thing that if the courtrooms underprice the harm from let's say the government 13 million is let's say that's an objective standard. I mean, we can get into a whole discussion about that. Let's just pick that as a number because this is about teaching the principle, not arguing the number, right?
Makes sense.
If that's the objective standard and the going rate in courts in some states is 2 or 3 million and it should be 13, well, what do? Well, you can tell the courts they have to award more money, or you can regulate by saying, no, you're just not allowed to do that. And so when you have an economic dislocation, one of the other tools you have available is you can regulate. You can say, no, your car has to have airbags. I'm sorry. I know it's cheaper for you to pay out victims, but you're going to have airbags. That's the way it's going to be. That's why we have regulations.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And I know some folks hate regulations. I'm personally not a fan of regulations. I would much prefer to not need regulations because regulations are not the most efficient mechanism there is.
Yep, agreed.
If you have a market dislocation, sometimes what are your tools? If there's a market dislocation and the manufacturers aren't going to do what let's say we could objectively agree it's the right thing, but they can make more money by not doing it. They're not going to do it because they're in business to make money for their shareholders. They have an obligation to act that way.
Yeah.
So what's left? What's left is a regulatory hammer to make them not do it, or a courtroom hammer to punish them if they do.
I mean, maybe technological development to get to the point where it makes economic sense, but who's doing that? I mean,
Well, I mean,
doing
you may eventually get there, but until you're there, what's left is
right.
the threat of lawsuits and regulators, right? And in many cases, the lawsuits are undervaluing the harm, and they're especially with complex tech, they're incredibly hard to pursue. It's really hard to win a lawsuit. It's like, well, here's my million lines of code. You think there's a bug in it? Go take a look. Have fun with that, right? I've literally been in the room doing that. It's no fun. Okay.
Yeah, I'm
It's
sure.
it's very, very hard to pull off. Or you could have regulators saying, no, you're just not allowed to build that way. I mean, there's a reason we have building codes,
Yeah,
right?
makes sense.
Because buildings were falling down and the building codes are so they don't fall down anymore.
Yeah, and fire codes, you'll get people getting locked in buildings,
And fire codes and all this other stuff. So when there's no economic incentive to fix it, you have regulators to tell you have to do it a certain way, or you have tort law, product liability, things like this on the back end, but the bodies have already piled up by the time that kicks in. That's the problem with that one.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, I mean, why would you create a regulation proactively? Like a lot of
So regulations are reactive, but at least they stop the flow of harm. And lawsuits are another. So regulations and lawsuits are both lagging mechanisms, right? To be sure, but the threat of a lawsuit or a occasionally the threat of regulation
Oh,
will
interesting.
motivate manufacturers to up their game so they don't have to go there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
So now I know lots of people in the industry say, "Oh, lawsuits are terrible, nuclear verdicts, all this other stuff." But with the historical non-regulatory approach of a lot of the federal government administrations we've seen, lawsuits are the only thing they're keeping us safe right now.
That's a
It's
really
sad.
interesting way of looking at it, and I don't think it's incorrect. But like
Yeah.
it's
Well, yeah. I mean,
making me think.
I know lawyers who do tort law and product liability have a reputation. I'm very well aware of it. I've worked with some of them. Some of them are good people I really like, and some of them not so much, right? And on both sides, and it is what it is, right? But right now, the lawsuits on the back end are the primary method of safety enforcement for automotive, and for a lot of consumer goods.
Yeah, that makes sense. I
That's
mean,
really where
it's
the
it's
practice comes
it's the
from.
check and balance. It's the way to hold the companies accountable. Otherwise, what are the leverage
Otherwise,
you
there's
have?
no accountability at all, and
Right.
we're back to the books you read about the 1800s, right? And the robber
Yeah.
barons, all that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess, yeah, court of public opinion maybe, but not really. I don't know. Yeah, there's other stuff.
Not so much, not really, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, we started with safety, we ended up with legal stuff, but
No, this is interesting. We might break this up into a couple of smaller episodes. Like I feel like this has been a really fun conversation.
okay,
Um, I guess this seems like a good place to wrap. Unless there's
sure.
anything else you want
Well,
to fit in.
so there's one other thing. So I'm currently. It looks like I'm working on a book. I have enough of it done that I'll say publicly I'm working on a book, and it's the stuff I learned after I did the book about how safe is safe enough.
Cool.
So I'll talk about that for just a minute.
Absolutely.
The Safe Enough book is if you want to be better than a human driver, what does that even mean? And like 300 or 400 pages later, it turns out to be a really gnarly problem because which driver when and doing what and in what vehicle and all these other things. Okay. So when I got done with that, I realized that I'd only taken on like one piece out of a bunch because the engineers want to think that way. Engineers want to think about, well, I'm safer than human. What's your problem? And so then I do these thought experiments like, well, whatever, when you kill is a school kid, and you kill half as many, but everyone's a school kid in a crosswalk in a school zone. Yeah, that's not going to be okay, right? And now I'm not saying that's hypothetical. That's really not going to happen. But the fact that it's not okay proves that reducing the total number can't be enough. Just a thought experiment's like, well, no, I just proved that that's not actually enough because there's a special case that proves it wrong. And it's a more general case that if you're doing excessive harm to vulnerable populations, even though the average goes down, the distribution matters.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm still wondering how you quantify that, but we probably don't have time to figure that out in this.
Right. Well, there's going to be a whole book on this stuff, right?
Awesome.
So,
I'm excited.
so one of them is that there are a bunch of others. It's not okay to run stop signs like, well, I'm late and I haven't killed many people lately, so I'm going to run stop signs because I get a free kill because I'm in a hurry. It's like, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't.
Or because you were safe previously. to your argument you gave on the last
You don't
thing
get to
around.
put
Yeah.
lives saved in the bank and spend them later because you're in a hurry. That's why we have negligence in tort law and criminal law. It's not okay. It's not okay to be reckless.
Right. No, that makes sense to me.
It's like, well, people make innocent, honest mistakes. I get that, but if you're being reckless on purpose, you're not allowed to cause harm, and it doesn't matter what your average stats look like. You're not allowed to blow through red lights because you're in a hurry just because you have a good safety record. That's not okay. So it turns out that the average number of fatalities is the starting point of the conversation, not the ending point. So
That's
that's
really
part of it.
interesting.
That's part of it. And the other part is there's not a lot of information to help folks who aren't experts put together um, safety and human factors and security and AI. I mean, try and find someone who can talk about all four of those things intelligently, right?
Yeah, good luck with that. Not in one brain. I mean,
So, and if you're a journalist who you have to reconcile for, you don't You're not going to get viable products without all four things. So people need at least to be able to be conversant in all four things. So somehow,
Clearly, you're not going to be an
somehow,
expert. You're going to know enough.
you don't be an expert, but
Yeah.
you have to be smart enough to know what you don't know,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
You have to know what the deal is in all four things. Like, well, I explained safety earlier, right? What is safety really? Okay. Well, you need to understand what is security really. You need to understand what AI is really. You need to understand what human factors are. Because all these things, even if it's a robotaxi, it's still interacting with people one way or another.
Yeah.
So that's the universe of things that I'm trying to collect into a coherent book, and we'll see how I do.
That's awesome. I'm excited to check it out. Do you have a rough timeline on it yet, or is that still TBD?
2025.
Nice. That's coming soon.
Yeah, we're already a third of the way through, a quarter of the way through it. So
Awesome. Well, I'm excited for that. Definitely, please let me know when it publishes. I'll promote it on all of my social channels.
sure, I'll
Really
be happy to
appreciate you
come back
coming on.
on and talk about it when I know what's in it. Really.
Oh, you absolutely should. I'm looking forward to it. I always enjoy our conversations, Phil. And yeah, I appreciate you coming on.
Okay, my pleasure.
All right. Take care, sir.
Thanks for joining us today. If you've made it this far, chances are you'll like other episodes too. Collaborative with Spencer Krause is available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, and Radio Public. Subscribe today to get notified when the latest episodes release and support the channel. Collaborative with Spencer Krause is sponsored by SKA Robotics. If you're in the market for elite field robotics expertise, please consider hiring SKA Robotics. They sponsor this podcast and solve some of the toughest engineering problems in the world. SKA Robotics can be found at skarobotics.com. Thanks again, and see you on the next one.